Okay, welcome to episode 6. I promised in the last video that I would go over crafting macros. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Macros are fairly complicated, or at least they can be. They can also be pretty straightforward and pretty simple. So the first thing is a little recap. We've already gone over some macros and we've put them over here. So over here I have a no log. I have my AFK sample. I have my surveying. This is my dump all. I put the scout command forage over here just because it's good to get random things. I have the macro called piecing, which I'll cover when we do a combat-oriented video. I have my mount. And then over here I have a macro called barkers, so if I need training, I can simply make a couple changes to this macro and I can spit out looking for training and yada yada. But over here, I have 8 crafting tools. These are all just garbage level crafting tools. They're really not that great. So we can see they're negative 14, negative 14, negative 13.89, so that one's even better. Negative 14. That one's negative 12.66, but anyway. So because of the speed that the macro is capable of going at, the macro can actually move between crafting tools so quickly that if you're doing low-level artisan crafting, you really want 8. So I've put 8 up here. Now the way I've designed the macros is I've used aliases, and with the feature of the alias, I can actually change how many crafting tools I want to use. So if 8 wasn't enough, and I want to add 4 more and go up to 12, that would actually be pretty easy. Or if I only had, say, 4 tools, I could move these tools up here and then just change the alias set so that when I get here, I loop back to number 1. But the way it works right now with these generic tools, I click a button here and it starts the set. It will complete the crafting session and then it will set the loop so that it'll begin on 2. And it'll do some crafting and then it'll move on to 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and on and on. I have a button here which is very useful for doing crafting when you're a scout or a medic, or if you're creating artisan things that you actually want to keep. So what this macro does is it changes the macro set so that I can set the button to practice and not fill up my inventory, or I can set it to practice, get a little more XP, and not have to fill up my inventory with a whole bunch of stuff. So that's pretty handy. And without that, I would have to manually do crafting from tool to tool. And so having this little macro here is not important, but it certainly is helpful. So we'll get into that. Then I've got a button here, which is called crafting reset. And the crafting reset does a /dump, and then it resets the crafting stage so that you start back at number 1. So if I was on crafting tool number 5 and I hit that and then close the crafting window, next time I hit this, it'll start at number 1. And where that's not actually necessary, I always prefer to start with 1. So let's get started first of all, after we put, where'd it go? Okay, right there. After we put a crafting tool into each slot, before I had these, I put these use tool numbers right above it. So if we come over here and we do an edit, now use tool number 1 says /tool action toolbar pane 05 and a semicolon. What that does is this toolbar starts at 0. So the one that is labeled number 1 is actually tool pane 00. And the one that's labeled 6 is tool pane 05. So I put that onto all of the use tools just to make sure I was on the right toolbar pane. And then we have UI action toolbar slot 12. The way the numbering works on the toolbar is this is 00, and then it counts up to 11, and then we have 12, and it counts up to 23. So you have 24 in total, but it starts at 0. So keep that in mind. So by saying we are going to activate toolbar slot 12, that means we're going to push this button with the macro. Now the next thing is /macro crafting 1 and a semicolon. We'll cover that in a second. We will pause 1, and then we have this /command alias toolnum /macro use tool 2. There should be a semicolon. Now let's ignore the alias bit for now, and let's ignore the pause. So if we didn't have the last 2 lines, I could have a button above each tool, and then all I'd have to do is just click on the button. That would activate the macro, and the macro would activate the tool. Now, that doesn't actually really give you anything because I've got the tool on the toolbar, so I can actually just click on the tool and it will start crafting. But by creating a macro here, I can have other macros reference this macro. So that actually brings us into this toolnum macro use tool tool. So what an alias is it's a shortcut. I can use this alias command with a name. In my case, it's toolnum. And then I can set toolnum to be any command that I would put into the chat bar. So I can actually, in the chat bar, type in /macro use tool 2. And that will activate this macro, or the macro that would have been here, which will use this tool. So by having use tool 1 set tool num to be macro use tool 2, which is right here, I've actually made it so that all I have to do is repetitively call tool num, and I can cycle through one tool after the other. And then in use tool 2, edit, and there should be a semicolon there. Use tool 2. It has, my microphone is caught. Come on. Okay. In use tool 2, it sets the alias toolnum to be use tool 3. Then on use tool 3, it goes to 4. Then on 5, it goes to 6. 6, it goes to 7. 7 goes to 8. 8 goes back to 1. So by activating the alias toolnum, I can increment my way through each of these macros. So I don't actually need to have all of these macros up on the toolbar. All I need is to have one macro or one button here that is toolnum. Now the problem with using this with an alias, if we come over here, alias toolnum / macro use tool 2, but this alias does not appear in my command browser, so I don't actually get an icon that I can move over onto my toolbar. So that would seem like a disadvantage, but all I need to do is create a macro called toolnum, or it could be anything. Then the macro calls the alias. So /toolnum with a semicolon. Now, this button is, I don't know if you can read that, but it says macro toolnum. So when I click on this, it will call this tool. It'll call the crafting macro, which we haven't gotten to. And then it will set toolnum to be tool number 2. And then when this goes through, then it will set toolnum to be tool number 3. And on and on and on and on. So at this point, all I would have to do is click on this button. It would let me do crafting in the first tool, then complete it. Then it would set it for tool 2. Then I can just click here and it would open up tool 2 and I can do all the crafting. And I can go through at a pretty decent rate just by clicking this button at the end of every crafting stage. But we can actually take that a bit further, and we can have the macro at the end of this sequence call toolnum for us. That way we'll automatically start tool 2 when we're done with tool number 1. And then because it's sequential, it'll move on. Now, if any of you are programmers, which I happen to be, you would be thinking, well, can I use any variables? Can I use a for loop or a while loop? And the answer is no. You do not get to set any kind of variables. You do not get to set loops of any kind other than a recursive loop. And so you also don't get an if statement. So that's really where the alias command comes into play, is because you can use a macro to set the alias command for the command that you already used. So an example of that is this crafting set. So I can actually turn on or off practice mode, and that is pretty handy. But we'll get to that in a second. But with toolnum, calling toolnum, then I can sequentially cycle through all of my tools. Now, if I were to go and replace these generic tools with my food and chemical tools, which I only have 4, then at the end of 4, instead of setting to tool 5, I would set that to tool number 1. And then all my problems are solved. So just by making one little change, I can set the sequence length from 8 to 4 or however many tools you want. Now, if we stop clicking at random things, you can see that we call the macro crafting 1 from the used tool number 1. In fact, we call macro crafting 1 from all of the used tool numbers. What crafting 1 is a modified version of crafting, the macro crafting, which I wrote and I can't find. So let's take a look at that. Now with this crafting macro, it does not let me select whether or not I want a practice mode. It always uses practice mode, and that's why I went to crafting 1 with a little button that lets me choose practice or not. But let's cycle through here. Now, one thing with this, when you start, you have to find whatever it is that you want to craft just by clicking on one of your tools. Go into it, get to the point where it lets you select resources, then close the window. Now, if I do the same thing on any other tool, it will go to whatever draft schematic that I used last time. So you can see now it says Stimpack A. Click over here, click on a different tool. Oh, that's rude. So you can see it always selects whatever the last schematic used was. So there is an option used by some people that instead of having UI action default button here, they have a line on top that says select draft schematic, a number, and the semicolon. What that does is it actually selects, whatever this is, number. So if I wanted to craft bone armor boots, that has a schematic number. If we open up the draft schematic, the data pad, there's a draft schematic tab. And then we have all of this stuff that our character is able to build, which is quite a bit in our case because I've got Scout and I've got Medic and I've got Artisan and I've got actually all of the base crafting professions. So to figure out what boot or bone armor is, we would have to come over here and click on this one, generic crafting tool, so that would count. Generic crafting tool, that one would count, and that one would count. Advanced biological effects uses generic, so that would count. Specialized crafting tool, so that does not count. Specialized does not count, does not count. Generic, so that one would count. And that one would count. So far, we've got 4 that counts on this line. And then this one counts, so that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So, if over here, let's say I click on that, now I come over and I put in / select 11. Funny. Oh. Did I type it wrong? No. Oh. You need a space between the command and the number. And for whatever reason, when I did select 11, it gave me the chance cube instead of the bone armor boots. So you would have to basically go through all of the options on all of the numbers to figure out what the bone armor boots number are, and that's just a waste of time. So instead of doing that, we preset whatever it is that we want to build by just coming in here, going chemical, stim pack A, and then closing it. Now we've set our draft schematic. So now we can skip that whole process of doing the select because that's a waste of time. And then we have the /UI action default button. What that does is it just hits next. Boom. Okay. So now we're in this window. And we do a pause 3. Pause, what the command sounds like, is it waits for 3 seconds. This number is in seconds. And yes, you can put a decimal point after it. And so you really just want to work out the amount of time necessary for however long it takes you to double click. So I would click over here, then over here, and I can do it in 3 seconds. If your computer is a bit slower, or you just don't want to have that much, you don't want to put yourself into a time constraint, you can change this number to whatever you like. Then we have 3 next crafting stages. And all that does is it hits assemble for you. Hits assemble for you here. And now we are on to the next piece. Create prototype item, space practice, space no item with a semicolon. Over here, the P in the prototype is actually capital. And that's the only capital in the command. So create prototype, space practice no item means that we will check this box. If we just have create prototype with a semicolon, it will uncheck the box and click create object. Now we've already gone over the difference. If you do not have this on, it will create an item in your inventory and you'll get some amount of XP. If you click the button, it will not create an item for your inventory, but it'll give you more XP than actually doing the without the button. Did I word that right? I might not have. You get more XP with the button on than you do with the button off. So then we hit practice. Now you can see the tool has a number here. And it's set for 19. It's also over here. 14. At least it's not super duper slow. Okay, so it created the item, or created the practice item, and destroyed it. It cleared the tool, and it did not create an item for my inventory. And you can see that I got 31 points of medicine crafting. If I do the same thing with practice mode off, oh, by the way, I can give it a name. You can change this to whatever you like. Then we create the item. So now this tool is currently counting down. Did it create the item? Did I do it on practice mode? No. Oh, it made it. I don't know why it didn't show it to me, but it actually created the item. So now I have 2 more Stimpak A's, and the tool made it for me. So back over here with create prototype, if I put practice no item, it won't make the item, but it'll give me more XP. If I leave this off, then it'll make the item and give me slightly less XP. Then it pauses number 1, or pauses for 1 second, and then it calls the alias toolnum. So it sets, or the next tool has already been set as the number, and then by calling toolnum, I can activate the next tool. So when I'm done crafting with one tool, it automatically goes over to the other tool. Now I mentioned that use tool number 1 actually uses crafting 1 instead of crafting. So let's take a look at that. Unfortunately, these are never in alphabetical order. Okay, so here is crafting 1. So UI default action, and then we call crafting 2. Crafting 2 is actually an alias. So what crafting 2 does is I have a button up here that is called crafting set, and let's actually take a look at crafting set first. Crafting set is a macro that calls the macro crafting set. What crafting set does, or crafting set practice and crafting set prototype are set by the 2 macros, crafting set practice and crafting set prototype. So in practice, we set crafting set to prototype, and then in practice, we actually already did that one. In practice, we set it to prototype. In prototype, we set it to practice. So if I click this button, it will activate the alias, which can be set to either prototype or practice, and then it will switch to whichever one it isn't. So if we close that window and close that window, and I click over here, you can see I will practice, I will create a prototype. So it's basically a toggle switch. So if I have this to set, if the macro tells you that I will practice, then it will practice, not create a prototype, but give you more XP. So if we come back down here to crafting set practice, we have a /say command, which puts it into spatial, makes a little bubble above your head, and it gives you the note, I will practice. Then it sets the alias crafting 2 to macro crafting 2 practice. And then it sets the alias crafting set to create prototype. So what is this alias crafting 2? Well, crafting 2 is an alias that gets set to either be practice or crafting 2 prototype. So let's find crafting 2 practice and crafting 2 prototype. So let's click on that. Now, on the practice one, we have the second half of the crafting macro. So we pause for 3 seconds. We do the next crafting stage, which brings us to the window that we can select whether or not we want practice mode. And then this macro, which is crafting to practice, uses practice no item. It pauses 1, then it calls toolnum. Over here on crafting 2 proto, It's exactly the same, but it doesn't have practice no item. So it will actually create items. Now, if you're using this style of macro and you're a scout or you're a medic or even an artisan that's making food or melee power-ups and ranged power-ups, stuff that you're actually going to be using, then you can use these macros to quickly create a bunch of items and have it in your inventory. So I find this to be extremely beneficial. Now I know this seems a little complicated, if you will, but the benefit here is I can set whatever item I want to make. I can set whether or not I want an item for prototype or for practice, and then I just click here. So let's do that. Let's see, what should I make? I don't have any drink containers. Carbo syrup, I don't have any of that. Organic cereal, light food additive. Light food additive is optional, so I should be able to create some Bofa treats. Organic cereal. Oh, I don't have any. Oh, okay. So I've set my tool to make Bofa treats. Okay, so I want to create a prototype. Click a bunch of times. Wait. Click a bunch of times. Wait for it to go away. Click a bunch of times. Wait for it to go away. Click a bunch of times. So I've already made 4 of them. Here's 5. If you watch over here, you can see what tool I'm using. I'm on number 7 now. I'm about to use tool number 8. And when I'm done, I just click on this crafting reset, which does a dump to stop the macro. And it sets the tool number back to number 1, regardless of wherever it was in the sequence. And I can just close that window. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, should have 8. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. I should have 8. Oh, I bet I know what happened. Sometimes items can get stuck in the... Actually, this is quite beneficial. So sometimes items can get stuck in the crafting tool if your inventory is too close to being full. So we can click, if my mouse will unclick. Prototype has been finished, and now I have an extra one. Oh, my inventory is actually full. So I have 77 items. Bit too many Bofa treats. What do they do for you anyway? Plus 39 health for 31 minutes. Actually, that's pretty handy. But let's get rid of these so I can free up my inventory. Okay, so I have 72 items in my inventory, which seems to be quite a bit. Let's get rid of these. Okay, so I'm down to 68. That's pretty decent. So I just created a whole bunch of candy, bofa treats, rather. And I got through that pretty quickly. So if you are using Artisan to actually play the game, or rather assist you in your primary goal, which might be combat missions, then you can use your crafting macros to create items for you, such as food or more medicine, scout traps, so forth. And if you are just looking for crafting for the purpose of progression in the come on brain, in the artisan tree, then you can make it so that you do practice items and you just scream through it. So that's pretty much all I have for macros. Go ahead and hit subscribe because we will be doing a video tutorial on most of the professions in the game. Hit a like if you want to, and have a nice day.